Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a botany lesson to share with you today. We're working through the final lessons of our botany main lesson block, and we've covered monocots and dicots and flowering plants and trees. And so we're going to be concluding these lessons with a couple of somewhat religious lessons based on botany. And we've done previously our illustration and our lesson for the date palm, which is a monocot, and now we're going to be talking about two more flowering trees, the olive tree and the fig tree. But I am going to add one more section to our date lesson, our date palm lesson, which has religious context. And so the top part of this page is going to be devoted to the remainder of this lesson. So we got a little bit carried away towards the end of our main lesson block, and now we've run out of pages. And so we don't have quite enough pages to do the remaining lessons that we want to do. So for this part of the page, we're going to do the illustration and the content for the fig tree. And then on the last page, we'll do the olive tree. So for this lesson, I am taking inspiration from this book called The Plants of the Quran. And you can see some beautiful illustrations here in watercolors of fig fruit, as well as you can see here a branch with the figs and the different variety of figs. This book also goes into detail about the verses or hadith that pertain to the plant that's mentioned, as well as some of the Arabic words, some history about the plant that's being spoken of, and any biblical or Quranic references as well. So at the beginning of the book, there are some biblical references if you wanted to know some other more context for the different plants that are mentioned. So this is going to become our illustration inspiration for this lesson, and then the content will become the content for the lesson. So for this lesson, we are going to be using some chalk pastels as well as chalk pencils. But before we begin on that illustration, I'm first going to write the content for our previous lesson. And these lessons at the end of the main lesson block somewhat all coordinate in that they are all plants that are mentioned in the Quran, but the date palm is a monocot, whereas the fig and the olive are dicot. So there are botanical differences between the two. I'm going to use this illustration here to add to this portion or this portion of the main lesson book so that I can add my content here, and then we will continue with our lesson on figs. For this portion of the illustration, I'm going to use these General's pastel chalk pencils, as well as my Sargent Art square chalk pastels. And both of these will need a matte fixative once you are complete with your lesson, otherwise the work will smear, but this one's already been fixed, so you can see that none of the chalk comes off. We're starting off in the top right-hand corner of our page with our dates kind of going off a little bit horizontal. I would have preferred if it was a little bit more vertical, but that's okay. And I'm using our General's chalk pastel pencils for this, which works really well since this is more detailed work. And if I had used my Sargent Art square pastels, probably would have lost a lot of the detail. And I'm working with sort of a muted red color, has a little bit of pink and purple in it, and I will come back in with more purple. It was a little bit hard to get the colors just so. I'm not really great at mixing colors together to get the pinks and purple hues. I'm a lot more comfortable getting the different greens and browns since those are the colors that we do mostly with our illustrations. But coming back in with a little bit more of the purple color gives it some dimension and some shading. And so I do like the way that it looks like in the end, even though it doesn't quite look like the inspiration picture, just because I would have lost all the detail if I had put that many dates in this image, which is more realistic and appropriate as per the illustration that I'm copying. I'm coming back in with a little bit of black to give some detail, but I think that is too dark, and had I done this again, I would have used a brown rather than a black in order to add some shading and some detail. And then I come back in to add a little bit of the date palm itself and some of the leaves, just so that it gives a little bit more context for why these dates are like this, but then it also kind of makes it look like it's going off in a horizontal direction, which isn't the way that it's supposed to look. It should be hanging down a little bit more. And then for the content for this first portion of this half of the page is the hadith that talks about Muslims being compared to a particular tree, and the Prophet ﷺ had asked the companions, what tree is this? Amongst the trees, there is a tree, the leaves of which do not fall, and it is like a Muslim. Tell me the name of that tree. And so everyone was silent, no one spoke up, and there was one person who wanted to say something but was a little bit shy, and so then they were saying all these different trees that are in the desert, and none of them were correct, which is so interesting to me because I didn't imagine the desert being filled with a lot of trees, and when I think of the desert, especially in Arabia, I do think of palm trees. But anyway, the answer was a palm tree, and so we spent some time writing about the positive attributes of a palm tree and how it relates to the Muslim. For the lower half of the page, I'm going to be doing a fig leaf and then 2 figs in the bottom corner of the page. And I did go off into part of the writing for the date part of this lesson, and it was in part to get the shape of the leaf correct. But once the image is done and I spray it, I do go back in and I retrace some of those letters so that it's a little bit more visible so that you can see the written content on top of the leaf. So I spent a little bit of time doing the leaf, trying to get the colors just right and the shape just right. And then I work on the 2 figs. And the one that is a cut fig, where you can see the cross section of it, the shape isn't quite right. It looks like it's a little bit too squished. And I tried to fix that, but it wasn't really working. So I just let it be the way it is. And once you get enough detail and then that fig in the background, it really doesn't look so unproportional in the end. So I'm using basically 2 colors for the center of the fig, just a pale yellow and a red. And then for the fig, I am doing one of the purple-ish colored figs rather than the green figs that for me are the ones that I'm familiar with, since my mom has a fig tree and it is the green kind that are ripe in September versus these kinds, which is a different variety of fig, and they're ripe at different times of year. And so I went ahead and put that one in the background because the illustration shows that kind of fig that I was copying. And I think the color is so gorgeous. So I spent a little time getting the colors just so, and then using some white in order to add some highlights. Now is the fun part. It's time to spray it. I'm using my matte finish. You want to do this outside. It does smell quite a bit, and it does take a little bit to dry. We're doing these lessons in September when it's nice and hot, so it doesn't take too much time to dry and sort of outgas so it's not smelly. And once it is dry completely, it's time to work on the written portion for this lesson. I added a little bit of shading underneath the leaf and the fig just to make it look like it's just sitting there on the side of the page. It's very subtle. You can't see it very much. And then I'm going to be writing the content for this lesson. It took a little bit to figure out what to write, only because the space is so limited, and I wanted to make sure that I included some religious aspects for these lessons, because these lessons on the date palm, the fig, and the olive tree all have religious significance as well. And so we're putting them within the botany lessons at the appropriate times of talking about monocots and palms and cereals, etc., as well as the flowering trees. And so they're in the appropriate space in the main lesson block, but they are as religious as they are botanical and scientific. So I've added some religious content as well as some interesting facts about the fig wasp, which is very interesting. And then that completes our lesson. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson on the fig and the date. I hope that you include some of these resources into your main lesson block if you want a little bit more diversity for your botany lesson. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information as well as other tutorials. You can find the link to that blog post down in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.